I'm seeing the other half of my research team, Dr. Larkins. So thank you, Dr. Lyons and Dr. Wesley, for my gracious introduction, and particularly for carving out a space for us to talk this evening during such a busy week. I also want to thank Jenna Altamira. I don't see where she moved now, but she's the person, thank you, behind all of this organization, particularly now having to straddle doing virtual, coming back to virtual hybrid at our request so that asynchronous people can be here also. So we're really appreciative of that. So I'll be talking about crafting a lifetime of becoming a culturally responsive researcher. I want to consider what a lifetime of diverse, inclusive, equitable, anti-racist, critical, intersectional, culturally responsive, and humble research might look like. And I'd like to consider how we might meet the potential and the promise of this research. So as was said, my comments draw on my forthcoming textbook. I can't really say it's impressed because I'm still writing one chapter, so we have a ways to go. But mostly, actually all my work draws on the hundreds of students that I've had the privilege of peering over their shoulder while they do research. In fact, I see a student I just had the pleasure for meeting the first time in person, Mandy Lee, that first introduced me to the idea of critical whiteness. It brought together a lot of the things I was trying to think through in a very theoretical way that was very helpful. So just this semester alone, I have learned more about how to conduct research on writing anxiety, self-compassion, reduction of gambling addiction, teachers' sense of play in the classroom, depending on your teacher when you think back of your pre-K-12. Isn't that an amazing idea, play in the classroom? Teachers who are stayers, women and non-conforming gender people in statistics, undergraduate LGBTQ plus history courses, unschooling, diversity, equity, and inclusion at the pre-K-12 level leadership, learning a new language with recent immigrants, creation of a campus community with people who are disabled, and much more. And I was telling Dr. Wesley when I got started, I'm actually not sick. I checked very closely, but I'm coming off of this horrible cold everybody's had. So I'm going to stop and drink periodically. Dr. Larkins, I told you I just stopped coughing, and that is not true. I started again this morning. So I've been helping organize and attend what we did call Research Evening for over 20 years. It did start in the basement of McKee first, and we would have to kind of poach classrooms because you can't reserve classrooms during exam week. They don't want shifting around, and we'd have to get the dean's blessing, my former dean, which room we could fit into. And so when the grad school took over this, of course, they have much more resources. So I'm really appreciative of this. And I came to and helped organize this before I had children, after I had children, and when my children were young, I would go and pick them up and then dash over here with them. They would be eating snacks while they strolled around and looked at posters. I can remember a conversation they had with Dr. Cox about his research poster. And now they can stay at home because they're youth. But my point is, I know that you have a lot of competing demands this evening. And so I'm so appreciative of you taking the time for us to think about these important topics and celebrating your work for the semester, but even more so the work of the research participants that have given us their time and their thoughts and their energy. Computers have crashed, people have been sick, people are ending internships, people this semester have tragically lost family members. And I am going to talk some about death in my personal comments later, so do feel free to do what's best for you to tune out or leave, although I do think that we need to normalize talking about death and not having it be something that we feel so awkward about. The semester doesn't stop for any of this, which on one hand is difficult, but the ones that have been in higher ed forever, we also know it's a relief. So if something awful is going on right now, it'll probably be over in 1 week. So that's the nature of higher ed. Oh, okay. Did it click for you? Because it doesn't for me.
Oh, it did. Sure.
Okay.
Would you like me to advance?
No, I have it here, okay. So I guess I'll just glance up if I'm unsure. All right. So I'm going to assume at the outset of my talk this evening that we agree research should create change for the good. And this idea of goodness, I draw directly from Dr. Lawrence Lightfoot. This is also supported, of course, by positive and hope psychology. And just a side point, it's really fascinating that the history of research has actually been the examination of what we deemed was bad, and we said we would fix it. And we're very comfortable with that. But as soon as we switch to goodness, people start to worry, oh, this feels kind of subjective. But as long as it's pathological and we've deemed ourselves an expert who can fix it, we're okay with that. So I'm going to challenge you, and these are not necessarily my words, these are Dr. Lawrence Lightfoot's, to continue to think about how can you look at what is successful, what is good, what is working. So one of the ways that I would suggest, particularly for the ones that are in qualitative research, is anybody can create trust with their research participants, but we have the opportunity to co-collaborate very deliberately with the researchers. So you can also look at participant action kind of research. And I'll have other suggestions for all kinds of research as we go through. So then this evening, I'm going to propose the tenets, what I'm calling the tenets of culturally responsive research. I'm going to explore the qualities of a culturally responsive researcher, and I'll only be able to review 3 quite quickly, because as I said, my comments are dropping down from a textbook length. And then consider ideas for staying renewed in research and receive actionable reflexive takeaways. It's actually funny, I just realized this technology thing, I can see that I switched it by looking at myself. The camera to the side. So you have this double thing here. So I'm not the person that came up with culturally responsive research. This came out of pedagogy from Dr. Geneva Gay, who's been doing this for a long time with all sorts of other people that work within teaching instruction in these kinds of areas, such as cultural competence, cultural sensitivity. And I pulled this together as a concept overall to bring all my thoughts together. So I'm actually going to use her direct pedagogical definition, but use it for research. And so it would go like this, inserting research. Culturally responsive research is a commitment to drawing on the cultural knowledge, prior experience, frames of reference and research, communication styles, a diverse research participants to make research encounters more relevant and beneficial from them. And if you reach back to the original work, it's working very heavily, so maybe 2 decades ago even, more in race, ethnicity, which is very important. And I've tried to open this up, as more recent scholars have too, to consider all the areas that are not dominant as far as identities, to unpack that. And you'll see that much broader in more recent papers. So then speaking directly to white researchers, as a white researcher, and researchers with other dominant identities who are dismissive of the attention dedicated to these contexts, higher education and research in general is embedded in a historically racist and currently systemically racist context. As white researchers, we need to clearly choose to work against research racism. There's no avoiding the issue without being racist. And then addressing the white researchers who currently work in this area and are eager to work in culturally responsive research contexts. This is amazing, and I'm so excited to work with other people in these areas. The commitment's not easy though, and we shouldn't expect any welcome or thanks. When we work in the rubble that we created, trying to create, co-create research, hoping for a different future, it may be the only clear change is a sense of who we actually are and who we are now attempting to become. So I'm going to look at the following possible tenets. And I'm setting these up as possibilities, considerations, things to think about, because the idea behind culturally responsive is that you could bring your own cultural assets, your own cultural beliefs, your strengths, and then you can infuse that and change that as you will. And also different disciplines have different areas of emphasis. So 3 that I'm thinking about for all researchers. The first is one, secondly, intersectionality. Third, critical whiteness. 4th, story is sacred. And this is something I hear Dr. Larkins talk. Avakan has this lovely quote from religious research literature, an unrestrained acknowledgement of the other, a genuine turn to the other is what is needed. So you may be familiar with the disturbing legacy of research that the study of the foreign other. So othering is a process that identifies those who are thought to be different from oneself or the mainstream, and it can reinforce or reproduce positions of domination and subordination. And I would add to the authors, Johnson et al., whose work is quite strong, that it does reinforce and reproduce positions of domination and subordination. Othering dehumanizes, objectifies, and distances the research participant as an exotic specimen from the researcher. People who are other may be marginalized, have less opportunity, or be excluded. And othering is really hard to sway because it's so powerful, and we'll never be able to fully do it. It's something you work against. It is a way that we mark people when we want to describe or talk about a new experience we've had. We're usually describing some kind of other, even if it's something that amazed or impressed us. Schwant has this helpful reminder for people like me to be humble. If you do critical research, you have not escaped othering. At some point, all research is about understanding something we don't understand, so we're trying to understand the other. So what is needed then instead is a deep reflexive consideration of self and a genuine turn to the other characterized by attentive listening, consideration, collaboration, co-creation, and relationship to one another. So intersectionality in research calls for consideration now of your personal identities within research, how these identities change and shift contextually, and the impact of your identities on you as a researcher and your research. So let's take me, for example. I am white, cis-het, middle class, an able-bodied woman, and my family has a tense legacy, two things working against each other, of being both colonizers and members of a persecuted pacifist religion. And even came to the United States very early in the radical wake of the Reformation. We also had persecution here, as do other very unique religious groups in the United States, as thankful as we are to be able to be here. But all of these labels would need further explanation and consideration by me and reflexivity about me for me to understand more deeply how I'm impacting research. So let's just take woman, for example. Within woman, some of my sub-identities there are mom, spouse, daughter, and I'm really starting to think about with daughter, I'm also a former daughter. Is that a word we would use? So my dad, my final parents recently deceased. I guess we need some kind of nuanced word there, because former, obviously I still think of myself as their daughter. Subordinated gender in my religious group, which was a huge part of my feminism. So within my religious group, I was subordinated at a level that many groups weren't necessarily in the 70s. And then being feminist for those different reasons. So you can see how just the one woman identity has all these other identities, plus all the stories I could tell you and more identities, of course. Then within intersectionality, we also want to think about, and unfortunately usually start thinking about, the research participants' identities. We need to start with ourselves, do our work with ourselves first, and then think about the research participants' identities. And one of the best ways to do that, of course, is to ask them. But as we're preparing for the research relationship, other things you can do, for example, is commit to pre-research, where you're starting to read about these groups, meeting with community members, other scholars, particularly local ones, that understand nuances of the groups that you're thinking about working with. We can really avoid a well-intended researcher making almost gross missteps with just some basic pre-research. I have a long story I'd like to say there about someone that came by the Mennonite church thinking I'd have a bonnet to do research, but we don't have time. There's the most Mennonites are progressive ones like myself. Okay, now am I at critical whiteness? Great. So then let's think about critical whiteness. Critical whiteness is an area all researchers can work in. So for all researchers, it's a commitment to researching and seeking to change the structures that create privilege. For white researchers specifically then, people such as myself, it's an acknowledgement of our white privilege and how we benefited from it historically and contemporary. It's being attentive to perspectives other than ours, being open to ideas, stories, and perspectives that we may feel defensive about or initially not even understand. And we need to look around and make a candid assessment of the spaces that we occupy in higher ed and think to ourselves, how did we get here? And have a sustained and collaborative effort to create research spaces where other people different from ourselves can also enter and thrive. Dr. Matthews and McKay, African-American scholars, have this quote from their research: "Until we are willing to break down whiteness, the hope of racial justice and anti-racism become a faint balloon rising beyond the horizon and drifting away." This is the one I'm the most interested in. I think we need to do an article when we ever have 2 minutes, Randy.
Yes.
Story is sacred has two important aspects. And again, because of time, I'm not going to share with you. There is a Jewish counseling scholar from CU, I think, that is doing several text blocks for the book. Her work is so powerful, this area of sacredness and story. If you're directly in the counseling areas, you'd be interested in it, I know. So sacredness has a sense of reverence. As researchers, we need to revere stories, and you can replace the word stories with data. Participants have shared with us. And so we don't want to, that could be very physically revering it, keeping it protected, to much more nuanced idea. Are we holding a space to revere a story that maybe we can't even quite recognize? It's puzzling or perplexing to us. You know, there wouldn't be any sense of mocking or dismissing the story. Reverence, it has a deep and abiding respect, regard, and honor, a commitment to looking for those moments and stories where research participants share memories they turn to, the glimpse of the transcendent that informs who they're becoming, or to address life's big wonder or small moments of wonder. So I'm going to tell you a story about my mom's death. And she might have died, I might be at 6 years now, and so I'm able to talk about it more comfortably. But if I did cry, I'm comfortable with that too. I had a professor, I was such a young student, I couldn't understand what she was saying, and she said, "We need to take back the right to cry in public." And boy, I agree with her now. But at the time I thought, oh, I don't know, you make me kind of tense. So my mom died a difficult, painful death over 10 days after a heart operation went wrong. Now, she had been born in a small, I don't even think you could quite call it a village, because she'd be almost 80 now, in rural, what we call now Tanzania, and she would never receive this kind of health care. But in the West, she was given the option to fly by helicopter just within a matter of hours, probably less than that, from Virginia to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, so a top hospital in the whole world. And we were assured by my cousin, who's a heart surgeon there, my cousin-in-law, that they had seen everything and could fix anything. So just let's start there with the privilege and inequity of that story. My mom is precious to me, but the amount of outlay our family and healthcare system was able to do for her certainly was inequitable. As they were starting to strap her in, load her up, she said, "Do I deserve this? Do I deserve this? I was born in a small village." So this is not a question that we can answer, of course. So I had the honor of being the last person in the family to be with her. As soon as we found out mom was headed there, we got on the interstate, my spouse and I, and drove up through the night. And then as soon as he dropped me off and got me in the right room, he turned around and went straight back to Virginia to be with our young children. And it was Easter weekend, and that was a very sacred holiday for my mom. So I had downloaded all sorts of hymns, gospel music. Mennonites are known for singing a cappella 4-part harmony, all the kinds of music she would enjoy. And when I met with mom, she was very disoriented from the flight and also from being in such a huge level of pain. So I said, "Well, would you like me to sing? I'm a former kindergarten teacher. I also taught preschool in a lab school with one-way glass. I can sing in front of anybody, anytime, for a long time." So I sang her. She said, "Yes, yeah." And at that time, she wasn't opening her eyes anymore. I sang to her every single Easter song I knew, every single hymn, folk song, ended up with all sorts of Pete Seeger until I was just completely exhausted. And then Mom started to have some kind of episode, and that's a teaching hospital where I'm going to say it felt like at one point 12 people poured into the room. So it's quite different because in many other hospitals, they'd ask you to leave. And so I had switched to my phone because I was so exhausted and was having the music play through the phone. Well, once all the people started pouring in, I thought, oh, I'm going to lose my phone and I'll be the only person here. My sister was trying to join from another state. How do I call anybody? So I took my phone, I cut it off, I put it in my purse. They were working on Mom, and I just fell into this exhausted sleep of kind of sorrow and fear. And then suddenly the room was completely quiet. The attending nurse was waking me up, and she said, your mom's calling for you. Your mom's calling for you. And they were getting ready to put her in a medically induced coma. And so I went over and said, you know, Mom, what is it? And she said, music, music, I want music. And I put the music back on for Mom, and then those were her last words because of the medical induced coma, and then she did, of course, die. So I had the honor of receiving this story as the only person from my family, and I've taken that story and I've given it back to my children when I talk to them about the power and beauty of music for people, even in our times of greatest pain and impending death. And this is an example of what I mean to you when I talk about story as sacred. And this, of course, is a very large story for my family. It could be something smaller, but we're listening for those stories from our research participants that are sacred. And I'm convinced whether you do true experiments around the therapies that Mom needed and the procedures, whether you're a counseling psychologist whose research is studying grief or secondary trauma, whether you're conducting narrative inquiry about loss, those stories are all sacred, no matter if they come out on a chart or a long narrative. Then the final tenet to commitment is always becoming. This tenet brings together all the other ones, and it says we're committed to those over a career of research. We're committed to doing the work necessary, committed to an extensive effort to understand oneself before researching others, committed to a sincere attempt to create research with research participants and not of research participants, which can include but isn't limited to co-constructed research, collaborative research, participant action research, and critical research methods, including quant crit. There's a huge amount of affordability in quant crit for the ones of us that want to do critical, culturally responsive research. It's a commitment to an integration of moments through the research where the research participant can express their experience. So as a methodologist, we weave those moments in at the end of an interview. We might say, what did the consent form, did the consent form make sense to you? Did all the questions make sense to you? Was there anything else I should know? So we're always trying to pull in this methodological information to move forward for the current study or for future studies also. It's where all my work around pseudonyms come from, asking people about the pseudonym process, and many, many people would like to use their own name. A pseudonym is a very white, litigious construct because we want to be sure that nobody is going to sue us. But on the other hand, some people feel stripped of their identity when you take their name. All right, so let's look at these qualities. And I had to narrow them down even more for my textbook because at some point a textbook has to sell, and they might not just want to hear the writer rant about qualities of a qualitative researcher. But I'm suggesting that qualities in general could be reflexive, curious, caring, trustworthy, responsive, joyful, humble, intrepid, and becoming. And I'm going to suggest to you and remind you at the end of the talk that you should have qualities that you think could be added to this list. And because our time together needs to primarily focus on your research, excitingly, I'm only going to look at 3 of them. I'm going to start with joyful, because sometimes I think joyful can be a little bit the most confusing, because obviously many, many research studies cover very tragic material. So I think of the quality of being joyful in research being one that, I'm cutting my time tight. Let's let's see what I'm gonna do here. I think I'll ask David if he can send the whole slideshow, because I really want to get to the next part. So I do want to say, I'm just going to say this really briefly. I think of, and at my home when I didn't do extra stories, it took exactly 30 minutes. I think of joyful as not only are you studying something that makes you joyful, so children make me joyful, and that's one of my research lines. Doesn't mean I'm always studying something that's amazing about them though. It could be a very difficult issue, but it's also seeking those moments of joy in the research. So don't forget, it's a human relationship you're having with the research participant, and we don't have to craft ourselves as this objective being who's holding back on all their opinions, because we're not. You're not able to do that. You can try if that's important to you, but you're not actually able to do it. The other one is humility, and I do have an article coming out on this in, I think, probably next month, and I'm really proud that I have 3 former students on the article with me. And from my background, even me saying the word proud, I start to cringe, because Mennonites should never be proud. We're actually proud of how humble we are. I'm sure some of you have very similar backgrounds that way. But this idea that the researcher, we want to say, Maria, what's your expertise? You just heard that. I'm an expert in children, I'm an expert. And instead we're coming into the researcher at a humble level in a research learning stance. This one, my children said, oh, Mom, are you going to include that? But I said, this is a very influential thinker. We have Socrates, pride divides, humility joins, and we have Kendrick Lamar, be humble, sit down. I live with Gen Z, and probably Gen Z should live in everybody's home and Gen A here pretty soon, because they keep you humble. And then the last one is intrepid, and intrepid, of course, is this bold sense. No person, and particularly when we're dealing with whiteness, wants to go and feel ashamed about something they've done or ashamed about something that's occurred historically in research. So instead, we need to focus on the other people, and that's an internal thing, and move beyond our experience. The other evening, I had done something at class that I wasn't proud of accidentally, and I was so glad someone told me, and I was able to process it. And the kids said, how did your class go? And when I said that, my 13-year-old said, well, they were the ones that you did it to. You were the one doing it. And so it's that Gen Z, yeah, Mom, get with it. So, focus externally, not on yourself. So you need to be intrepid and bold. Okay. Yeah, so I wanted to get to this really quickly. I felt like it got short-shifted in my classes too, so I'm trying to rethink through how we can talk about this more in my classes. Because when you go to do this deep work and you do feel shame at times, or you realize you made a terrible misstep, or you othered someone, you are going to feel exhausted at times. And then if you're from the groups that have been historically treated badly in research, of course you're going to get exhausted. And then we reach to these groups so often and ask them to help us with different things as a white person, that it's doubly exhausting as colleagues. So how can you stay renewed in a long career? I'm suggesting learn how to say no. I don't think I learned how to say no till my 40s. And in my 50s, I'm kind of feeling okay about it. So it takes a long time. And my hope for you is that you could learn much earlier than that. Another one, I think I'll just start flipping down through because of time. So when you say no and be unequivocal. No, don't say, well, I might be able to, don't do that kind of hedging around thing. I'm from the South, and I can interpret a Southern person when they're saying no. They're beating around the bush. They mean no. They're trying to kindly say no. And so just say no. And this say no allows you to say yes to your family and friends. You're going to have things that you have to say yes to in order to be a scholar. So say no to those extra things that are going to stress or overload you. And this idea comes from Bruckman of embrace a life of limit. You won't have time to do everything you want to do. So what do you want to do with the time that you have? I wish we could talk particularly with my faculty colleagues about craft meaningful research life a long time. I don't think we explain this to students enough, but and so I basically bumped into it. If you can integrate your pedagogy with your research and your scholarship, you start to move towards this level of expertise where you feel like you can share powerful things with people. But if it's spread out, this can be very difficult. And I bumped into it because I was a co-chair of IRB here I think maybe 16 years. And so I was a very bitter person. You know, it was always kind of shoot the messenger kind of thing. And I thought, what do I do with all of this? And I thought, oh, and I wrote a proposal to write a textbook that I was allowed to do then on culturally responsive research ethics, because I was so concerned that the Western ethics are colonizing the world with our ethics. Not everybody has an ethics, autonomous ethics system like us. And then the other piece is that, are we really being ethical, or are we trying to avoid litigation? And so then out of that, I developed the research ethics course that Dr. Larkins teaches. It's a 1-hour course, and I hope you get to take that. It helps you think about ethics specifically within research. Controlled connectivity, my children would say maybe I sound scolding, but I'm highly connected. I'm in a Discord group. The difference is Discord doesn't come to me. I go to Discord. I think our fancy phones that we're dropping the money on, it should be the modern day butler. And it should say, okay, Maria's not home now. She's writing a scholarly article. I wrote a ton of my work sitting in the car at pickup waiting for my kids. So I would just sit here. I wrote 2 entire published articles waiting behind stage for my son at theater. And so that was because I had no connectivity. Nobody was reaching out and bombarding me all the time. And then I think I have one more. Oh, and this makes me think of my mom also. My mom had so many friends. She had been in a retirement village about 4 years when she died and had many new friends. And so when we were at the funeral, one of the women said to us, "Oh my goodness, I thought your mom was my best friend." She said, "I see now everybody thinks she's their best friend." And it's because mom was welcoming. She had had to live in so many different contexts, and also as a youth without her family, that she learned, if she's wondering why is nobody reaching out to me, she should be the one reaching out. And so she always would go and reach out to people. One of the things I learned from her is, if you're a rushed person, like many times I feel like there's a lot of demands on my time, just go a little early and then you can look gracious. So instead of having to be like, oh, hi, because I have to get somewhere, if I leave early, I can stop. And someone wants to ask me something about the elevator, I can stop and answer them. If someone wants to ask me something, I was consulted with in a theater line, I've been consulted with in the bathroom. I had someone slowly ride their bike the whole way to my home when I lived a mile from campus, and said, well, that was a good time. I thought, oh, okay. I mean, they got a lot of information, but usually I decompress during that walk. So then some last things, we'll see if, like I said, if David can send this. These are some questions I think you could ask yourself as you think about how you're going to build on your research for next semester. So one thing qualitative researchers do that I think all researchers could do is we keep these reflexive journals. So could you commit to 1 entry a week specifically on things about intersectional identities, for example? What could you say no to next week? Now notice I didn't say this week. I think that might be a loss. But next week, in order to say yes to yourself, is there something that you could move off of your plate? What can you commit to reading, following, attending, or doing that will deepen your culturally responsive research understandings? And this might feel a little flip, but I would say in the busy life of a graduate student, the idea might be podcasts, because then when you're exercising, commuting, those types of things, you could be deliberately reading up on these areas. So if you just look at Indigenous people in research, or you wanted to look at LGBTQ people in research, these have rich podcast areas that I know that I learn a lot from. Looking at the qualities of a culturally responsive researcher, I already said, what would you add to this? What do you already have in abundance? And which areas could you grow in? So in closing, let's continue to work together to create culturally responsive research that truly honors the sacred nature of the research participants' stories. And let us be bold, humble, joyful, and always becoming in research.
Thank you, Dr. Lehman. That was very interesting. And so we do have probably about 10 minutes or so, if anybody has any questions for Dr. Lehman.
And actually, I'm very interested in just a response too, because it helps me think. As I said, obviously, all these thoughts I've had are derived from my students and my personal experiences. Yes. Oh,
Hi, Dr. Lehman.
Hey,
This is
Sydney.
What are the two qualities as a qualitative researcher that you have been focusing on in your current research?
Humility, and the reason for that is, I don't know, maybe I bumped into it about 8 years ago, and it picks up in the medical literature and then moves to the counseling sites as though nobody's ever talked about it. And we all know why they're doing that. They do not want to reach back into the literature that's from spiritual, metaphysical, religious, historical understandings. But as researchers, we believe in that chain of literature. So what we did in this cultural humility article is we reached back and we looked at how atheists look at humility. There's this arrogance that some being had to put everything into work. We look at how Christians, Buddhists, and just quickly, of course, because it's not our expertise either, and then apply it to research. And so humility was so fascinating for me to see that as a Mennonite, where that's one of our main doctrine. My one uncle told me he remembers being pulled aside by grandpa and saying, I think that maybe you took too much pride in winning that race. So it would have been at that level for his generation. Thank you, Sydney. Dr. Larkins.
Tonight is the last night of that ethics class that we were talking about. So we're going to talk about ethics in today's culture. And I think the word culturally responsive, those two words sort of put a whole different twist on the ethics class this semester, for me at least. We had such a good discussion. And I'm thinking of especially about the responsive part. It's sort of like the word love. You think it's an emotion, but really it's an action. It's the way you treat other people and the way they treat you. It's an interaction. And cultural responsiveness seems to me to be the same. You think of culture as some objective word that you have to somehow define, but cultural responsiveness brings your actions into that and what you do to create that kind of culture. And I just really appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I feel very satisfied with the term now, but the original proposal was critical. And I'm from the state of Virginia, and the governor has pushed back very hard and said that we can't even buy textbooks that they have critical race theory in the title and such. Yeah. And so really having a push against the sanctity of the higher education and our thoughts. And so I thought, I can't imagine, I have 3 degrees from Virginia, if people that taught me or that I worked with or such couldn't buy my textbook. So I went back to the literature and thought and came up with this idea from Dr. Gay, which I think does bring in aspects of this, but it's also more inclusive, like I said, of other areas outside of race and ethnicity. I'm really glad to hear you're doing that. Boy, you have a busy evening though. Okay. All right, well, I really look forward to seeing all of your research and then staying for the awards at the end. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.